Confetti Antiques and Books, and we're here today with Brent Ashworth. Brent, welcome.
Thank you, Don.
We're here to talk about some things about Christmas collectibles, about Christmas through the years. Some of you might remember a few years ago we did a program where we talked to Brent about Dickens and about some of his Christmas collectibles. Today we're here to continue that and to turn the page and to talk about other Christmas collectibles. Brent, welcome to the program. We're glad to have you. What would you like to start today?
Well, thanks, Donnie. Just a little about myself. I've been collecting since I was age 7, so it's been 65 years. Collect all kinds of things, but my favorite holiday is definitely Christmas, and grew up in a family that was our favorite. Any rate, I have a little store in Provo called B. Ashworth where I sell rare books, manuscripts, art, collectibles, things like that. I've really enjoyed sharing things more than anything else because the collection is large, and we're attempting to get a museum for some of these things now.
Well, that's exciting.
But I brought some items. A couple we mentioned last time. I'll just mention them briefly. Really, Santa Claus was developed from St. Nicholas, who was an actual saint that lived in about 280 AD. So he goes way back.
Wow.
And as a result, he was basically St. Nicholas was a helper to the Christians, to Christ. And so it's appropriate that some version of him came down over time. Although in the last 2 centuries, a lot of things have changed his view by things that have been written and things that have been published and so on. One of the first was here in the United States by a professor in New York by the name of Clement Clark Moore. This is a letter of Clement Clark Moore he wrote. And he was a Episcopal bishop in New York. He actually donated property, which is still called Clement C. Moore Park there. But he wrote a little ditty for his little poem for his family in the Christmas of 1822. He had no intents of it ever being made published, and it was called A Visit from St. Nicholas. And it was again, a friend had sent it to published in the Troy Sentinel newspaper, and that was the first time it got published in 1823. And it kind of took off from there. In 1825, it made its first appearance in a periodical, and there are actually 2 periodicals, and this was one of them. It was called the United States National Almanac for 1825, and no name, no responsibility for who had published the thing. It just said a visit from St. Nicholas, and it was the night before Christmas is what we know it as today, which is the first line of the text. And it was published there, and then it was picked up by other publications. Again, he didn't want any credit for it because he was an uptight professor of languages and other things, and also an Episcopal religious leader there in New York. And he was, I guess, rather embarrassed by it, didn't want to be tied to it. Years later, when it became so popular that it made it into a gift book in 1837 called the New York Book. For the first time, it had by Clement C. Moore under the publication of A Visit from St. Nicholas. The title has still remained the same. And then in 1840, another edition was published in another gift. This was called The Poets of America. It's a pretty little book. They used to come out with a lot of these at Christmas time. This one was a little different, though, because it had C.C. Moore, Visit from St. Nicholas, but it had an early picture of what people perceived to be Santa Claus at that time, and
kind of the traditional Santa there.
Yeah, actually almost a pre-Thomas Nast look at Santa Claus, which is kind of rare. And then finally in 1844, Moore put out a collection of what he called his poems, and he wasn't going to add this poem because he felt like it was amateurish, but he did. His kids basically talked him into into putting a visit from St. Nicholas in it. And so he did. This particular copy is kind of interesting because it's inscribed by him. The author is the way he signed it, but it's January 46 he signed it. It came out in 1844, but by this time one other gentleman tried to claim ownership of it. Here's a book from Moore's library with his signature on it. And someone tried to claim ownership of it. That's pretty well been shot down over the years. But Moore's tradition, in words, he put down that he was a jolly old elf. He put down even that he came down a chimney. He put down that he came on Christmas Eve. The problem with Santa Claus that Christianity had was that they looked at him as being a rather worldly character over the centuries, and they didn't want anything to interfere with the birth of the Savior on Christmas morn. So he got around that by having the story that Santa appeared on Christmas Eve, and that took off. It became famous after that we could celebrate Christmas Eve in a more secular, non-religious way if we wanted to. It kind of gave everybody in the English-speaking world at least permission to do that. Well, then, jump ahead a few years, and from 1822, when that was first written, to Charles Dickens. And we spoke a little about this before, but this is a Christmas Carol. Now, Dickens was born in an age where his father ended up in debtor's prison. That's one of the things our founding fathers got rid of, was debtor's prison under our Constitution. But the British continued to have debtor's prison, and his father couldn't pay his bills. He'd worked for several departments, but he didn't have enough money to do it, and he was thrown into a debtor's prison. It was hard to kind of pay your debts when you're in prison, but he was. And Dickens, as a 12-year-old, was thrown into a boot blacking business, and it was a rat-infested factory that he was stuck in a corner of, and his job was to put the labels and containers of boot blacking with labels on them as a 12-year-old, and they eventually moved it to a place where people could look in and stare at the kids working at it.
Oh, boy.
And he always had a thing against child labor and against the terrible conditions. And by the time 1842 came around, he was a famous author. He'd written several of his more famous books by then, the Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, and Martin Chuzzlewit had just come out, and it wasn't doing very well. He decided he was going to write a political pamphlet because he'd been seeing kids in a mining operation, young kids, working in horrible conditions. Just that year, and he thought it reminded him of when he was a kid, forced to a factory before his grandmother died and left his father 450 pounds, which back then was the equivalent of so many $1,000 today, and got out of the debtor's prison. And then he attended a school for urchin kids of the street, and that made him sick too. So he decided, I'm going to write a pamphlet, a political pamphlet. And he went out for a long walk one night. He said it was 15 to 20 miles. And it was during that walk that he came up with the idea of writing a little novella, a short novel. And thus the story of A Christmas Carol came to him. So Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in a period of 6 weeks. And the ideas kept coming to him. In fact, he said that he laughed and cried for 6 weeks writing it. Because it had affected him so much. You can tell the first printing from all the later printings, because there were 11 printings of this made in the first year.
Wow.
And because of the lack of success he was having with Martin Chuzzlewit, which the novel, it wasn't doing too well right before he decided to write this political pamphlet, which ended up being this novella on the poor children and so on. And Christmas, he had to go out on a limb with his publisher and decide that he was going to pay the entire cost of publishing this thing, which really put him out on a limb. Plus, this is the only book he ever published that had gilt pages, and you can see the gilt here around it. Yeah, and it's the only one that ever had colored illustrations. George Cruikshank, the illustrator of some of his books, introduced him to a man by the name of John Leach. And Leach did 4 color illustrations for this book. This is the Mr. Fezziwig's Ball. It had a colored title page. Originally, he wanted to have green inside, and you can tell that the first printing because it has this horrible green that didn't adhere.
Oh.
And so after the first 6,000 copies were sold in 3 days, they decided to go with just yellow, which was the underneath color. And the first printing also has the book divided into staves, chapters, and the stave 1 is a numerical 1. They changed that to O-N-E for the second printing. So that's how you can tell a first from a second. But this beautiful book had 4 of these color illustrations. Here's Scrooge's third visitor here. And they were all hand colored, which is kind of like courier knives here in the United States, where the mostly women would line up if they were the green lady or the whichever lady and paint that color. Here's one of Marley's Ghost. That was one of the 4 that was in color. And then there was a 4th one here that was showing the Scrooge's grave. So that was a 4th. And there were 4 others that were just plain black and white. Well, the book was such a success, and he put so much money into it that he got a little bit of profit out of it, which was, he thought he was going to lose his shirt, but it got a little bit of profit out of it. And they published it 11 times during the next year. That he thought, well, I'll write a Christmas book every year. So the next 4 years, he wrote 4 other Christmas books. There's the Cricket and the Battle of Life, the Haunted Man, or the Ghost Bargain, and the Goblin Story. And these were written over the next 4 years. After that, he didn't feel like he had the energy to write a full book, so he wrote just little chapter stories, short stories, that were mostly very popular here in the United States. Brought a letter of Dickens too. This is a handwritten letter of his dated in 1857. Had a beautiful penmanship, and this letter is interesting because let me quote just a line from it. He says he was asked to do a reading. Dickens is the first of our Western authors that we know of that actually read from his own books. He put on shows reading them. He even had a playbook on Christmas Carol, which was the first book that he read from publicly. This particular letter says, I have since tried with some steadiness so to disentangle myself from other promises by a new arrangement of them as to be able to read my carol for my Rochester and Chatham institution. And I am now able to tell you that I will do so for you, please God, on any evening in the week before the next Christmas Day. So, so there's a letter referring to that. Well, here's an American edition, early American edition, which kind of shows you that taken off. This was published in Philadelphia, of A Christmas Carol and some of his other books. They were extremely popular here in the United States. Well, we go from those 2 gentlemen to the guy that really made Christmas into what we picture it today, and they still give the Thomas Nast Award to the best cartoonist in the world at 1 award a year. This is an original Thomas Nast cartoon here. It's framed up with a print of his signature. But this cartoon is kind of interesting for a local interest because it's the Mormon GQ cannon. It's interesting how BYU football games we shoot off George Q. Cannon. ROTC will come out and do that. This was one of the originals when George Q. Cannon was our delegate to Congress, and they wouldn't seat him because he was a polygamist. And so this had to do with cannon blowing himself up, and another guy that was claiming victory because he was a polygamist. Both of them got booted out of the Congress at the time. But he became a very famous political cartoonist, and actually that's the way Christmas his Christmas drawings started. They were political cartoons. And the first ones were printed in Harper's Weekly. Years later, this book, Nast put out this book, which was which was his Christmas drawings throughout the world. And the book came out in 1890. I'm sorry, it's Thomas Nast's Christmas Drawings for the Human Race, it was called. And this is kind of a condensed copy of his 100 or so drawings that he'd done, mostly for Harper's Weekly and some other publications. But he really invented the look of Santa Claus we know now. Nast is an interesting guy. He was a German, came over and started working for publications, and mostly, like I say, Harper's Weekly, which was kind of like the old Life magazine or Time magazine today. It came out every week, and it didn't have photography originally. It was all drawings. Photography didn't really take off till later in publications, but he did some wonderful Civil War pictures. The very first one had Santa sitting on a wagon giving out gifts to troops. He was very much, Santa Claus became very much a Union figure.
Oh.
Okay, as Santa's sitting there with a striped outfit with stars. Okay, he's clearly taking positions. Thomas Nast was a pro-Union guy through and through, and so Santa became a pro-Union guy through and through. Well, after the war was over, he continued to draw Santa. He did some beautiful pictures. Here's just one I'm pulling out here. It's easy to see. Santa coming down through the chimney. The most famous one came out in 1881. That's this one here. And they did this in color too, so it became kind of the main look for Santa Claus.
For Father Christmas, really.
For Father Christmas, that's right. And so, at any rate, he did some other beautiful ones that were done throughout the years. This is an example of one of Nast's. This was illustrated, Santa Claus and His Works, it's called, illustrated by Thomas Nast. Now Nast, some people thought because he was a political cartoonist that the term nasty came from him, but the term nasty was around for a long time, but a lot of people used that because a lot of his cartoons were quite nasty. And by that I mean he invented a lot of political things. The Democratic donkey was around for a long time, but he popularized the way it looks today. He created the Republican elephant.
Oh.
So he's the originator of that, and he's the originator of what we think of as Santa Claus today. So the Thomas Nast Award is given once a year to the cartoonist in the world that gets the most votes. Is the best, kind of like the Academy Awards for cartoonists. Well, we go from that to the Nutcracker. Now today the Nutcracker is a big part of Christmas, right?
Yeah.
But it didn't used to be, and in fact, Tchaikovsky was very famous as he's the most famous Russian composer of all time today, particularly in the West. This is a rare handwritten letter of Tchaikovsky, and this was written from Paris in 1890, and he's writing a friend telling him that he has to go to New York the next week to open a hall for Mr. Carnegie. At any rate, it was Tchaikovsky that was invited to come from Russia. He was then briefly in Paris to come and open Carnegie Hall. And so he did. And he was right in the middle at that time of writing the Nutcracker. In fact, he took 25 days off from writing the Nutcracker in order to come to America and to open Mr. Carnegie's Hall. Then he went back to Paris, wrote part of the Nutcracker there, and then back to Russia and finished it off. Well, the Nutcracker was finished in 1892. He died in 1893, and he never really saw any success from it. When it was first, he was a very famous composer of many different types of music, but the ones that got him the most acclaim were like Swan Lake and Nutcracker, that were ballets. and they didn't take off real well. And Russia played for the first time in 1893, the year he died, and it didn't really catch on in the Western world until it was played in Paris in about 1934, and then in London in the 40s during World War II. And finally, in the mid-50s, Balanchine and a few guys in America made it very popular. And so it was 50 years, 60 years after he created it that the Nutcracker became part of Christmas. And so it didn't, like I say, it could have been lost to the dustpan of history, but it survived over time. Well, since then we've had a number of other traditions. Christmas cards, of course, they started during the Civil War period. This is just a little example of a this is not by Nast, it's by Prang, but Prang in Boston was famous for making beautiful cards. And this is a Christmas card by Prang, kind of telling a Christmas story about Santa Claus. And a lot of this stuff got popularized by the Civil War, the same period that Nast was doing his cartoons and so on about it. And then you have a lot of things that came along the way. This is the first edition of Miracle on 34th Street, which became very popular. The book was popular, and then it was made into movies. One of my favorites, the mother was played by Teresa Wright, who you may not remember, but she's my favorite actress, so I got to mention her, in the 40s. And then it was Maureen O'Hara played the famous mother's part with the young Natalie Wood as the daughter. And the gentleman that played Santa Claus actually took the Academy Award for Best Actor that year, 1947. Well, it was that same year, actually the year before, 1946, a little movie came out played by Jimmy Stewart and some other famous actors known as It's a Wonderful Life. This is actually a photograph with Donna Reed, who played the female part, Jimmy Stewart, and it's inscribed by Zazu, the little girl. It became a Christmas classic. Here's a signed picture with Mr. Gower, who we remember the Jimmy Stewart character saved when he put out the wrong prescription for someone. And after he lost his son during news in the war. This came out in 1946, but the critics didn't like it. It was not popular for years and years. In the 1970s, the copyright lapsed on it, and it was at that point that everybody, starting with one of the channels, could start publishing it, printing it, and it became a Christmas classic. So a lot of times, like Nutcracker, they didn't really take off right away. One of the fun things
is... It's not Christmas, though, without Jimmy Stewart anymore.
Not Christmas, is it? No. This is a V-mail war letter that a trooper sent home during the Second World War. Well, my father, my dad's, my wife's served in World War II. Her father was at D-Day, mine was at Iwo Jima. So we kind of had the war covered, but they couldn't write a lot about the war. But they were able to send their Christmas wishes home by what was called V-mail or victory mail. There's the V on the back and on the front here. And this is just a typical Christmas V letter there. One famous story from the 1890s is the story of the little girl, Virginia. One of the fun stories that came through a newspaper, The Sun, a little girl, Virginia, O'Hanlon, who had written a letter because her father said, if you read it in The Sun, it was true. And she asked, is there really a Santa Claus? And the editorial writer at the time wrote back this famous letter that, yes, there is a Santa Claus, Virginia, and talked about all the wonderful things that are done by Santa Claus throughout the years. And this is signed by her there when she was an older lady.
That's, in this world that we're in right now, I think the world needs something like Christmas, like, even Santa Claus. We need something that makes us feel good, makes us remember that there are good times amongst all the turmoil that we're feeling with the pandemic and elections and all this other stuff that's going on. And I think Christmas, even Christmas carols and Christmas stories and Christmas books, they kind of help bridge that gap and help us remember even our own childhood and coming down and seeing the presents and the Christmas trees and the lights and going caroling and just doing all this fun stuff.
They do. I think that's wonderful, Donnie, and I agree. It really is. There are a couple other famous things I'd mention. This is Dr. Seuss is a favorite of mine. I think he was a wonderful writer, great character. My wife and I served our mission in Springfield, Massachusetts, our last one, and that's where he was born. And his home's there, his museum's there. It's a delight if you ever get to Springfield. It's out on the western side of Massachusetts. But any rate, probably his greatest Christmas book was How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which came out in 1957. This is the first edition of it when it came out, and it's inscribed by Dr. Seuss here. It tells the story of the Grinch and the people of Whoville and how he tried to steal Christmas away from them. It's kind of a play on Ebenezer Scrooge in a way, kind of an updated version here in the United States, and how the Grinch steals all their presents, and then he sees that they're still happy in Whoville, even after they've lost their gifts, and he finally gets the idea that, hey, Christmas is more than gifts. So he decides to return all their gifts, and of course he has a change of heart. It's somewhat like Christmas Carol, updated a little bit, but he had some wonderful illustrations and stuff he put in here, and it's been used in different television shows, cartoon shows, and everything ever since. And then finally, one of my favorite things I wanted to show today, and I'm not sure I've shown this before here, but this is a manuscript by a little blind girl. It's a favorite piece of both my wife, Charlene, and I, and it's called Christmas in the Dark. It was first published in 1906 in the Ladies' Home Journal by a young woman by the name of Helen Keller. It's typed out on a Braille typewriter. And I imagine her teacher helped her, Annie Sullivan, with it. And then she signed it at the end, Helen Keller. Everybody wonders why her signature and handwriting is square. That's because she used a template, kind of like my father was an architect. Used a plastic or metal template where the letters were there, and she could write it out without having to see it. This is entitled Christmas in the Dark. I'll just read a few lines. When I was a little girl, I spent the Christmas holidays one year at the Perkins Institution for the Blind. Some of the children whose homes were far away or who had no homes had remained at the school. I have never known a merrier Christmas than that. I hear someone ask, what pleasure can Christmas hold for children who cannot see their gifts, or the sparkling tree, or the ruddy smile of Santa Claus? The question would be answered if you had seen that Christmas of the blind children. The only real blind person at Christmas time is he who has not the Christmas in his heart. We sightless children had the best of eyes that day in our hearts and in our fingertips. We were glad from the child's necessity of being happy. The blind who have outgrown the child's perpetual joy can be children again on Christmas Day and celebrate in the midst of them who pipe and dance and sing a new song. Anyway, she goes on to describe how they prepared for Christmas and how they shared the joys of Christmas. It's kind of like the people of Whoville that missed their gifts, but they had their gifts all along. So at any rate, there it is. It's kind of a little overview of a collection on Christmas treasures.
Brent, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, really a wonderful opportunity to get into the Christmas spirit, to get into the brotherhood of Christmas, the friendship of Christmas. And we want to thank you for taking your time and giving us a few minutes to review these treasures with you. Brent, Thank you. Brent,
thanks, Donnie. Merry Christmas to everybody.
Merry Christmas. If you get a chance, Brent Ashworth, downtown Provo, Bashworth's, stop by here in Confetti Antiques. Thanks again.